Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Rick Levine, and we're going to do a deep dive into the meaning of the zodiac sign Aries and talk about its different qualities and characteristics and significations in a really full 2-hour episode, just looking at the significations of that sign. So, hey, Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Chris. I'm happy to be here with you again, although I question the idea of doing a deep dive on Aries. Is there such a thing?
Yeah, I think your alternative title was a fast dive into Aries, which was probably more fitting and appropriate. But between your Aries and your Mars placements and my heavy Saturn placements, hopefully we'll find a nice middle ground in between.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the illusions about, I would say, both Aries and Gemini, is that they are shallow or that they're all up front, and they are, but there is depth in both of them in their own ways. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing this deeper dive. And for the record, I should mention that not only do I have, and we'll probably get here because I know you're very thorough with this stuff, not only do I have Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars in a close conjunction in Aries, but they are trine Pluto. So deep doesn't scare me.
Okay. Yes. Those are your bona fides for this episode, is your Aries stellium. So this is part of a new series. So I just finished a series last year where I went through each of the planets one by one and did an entire episode with a deep dive into the significations of each of the planets. And that went so well that I wanted to start a new series this year where I do the same thing with each of the 12 signs of the zodiac. So we're going to start this episode. This is going to be our first one looking at the sign of Aries. And in order to do that, I was trying to think, like, who is the best astrologer that has the most Aries placements? And you just kept coming to mind as like the top person on my list. What planets do you have in that again? And can I share your chart?
You absolutely may. I have Eris in Aries, like everyone else who's alive.
Right.
But I have the sun in mid-Aries, the sun at 16 and change. And I have Mercury, Venus, and Mars, all lower degrees, but all within a 6 degrees or so of the sun. So Mercury at 9, Mars at 12, Venus at 13, and the sun at 16. But I also have the North Node there too, and they're all in the 11th house. When uninitiated people ask me my sign astrologically, I sometimes tell them I'm an Aquariarian. Because even though I have no planets in Aquarius, Uranus is my first planet over the ascendant. I have an Aquarius midheaven, and I have 4 planets in the North Node in the 11th house. So I have that Aquarian flavored or airy flavored Aries energy.
Right. And that's really one of the complicated things once people get beyond, the initial phase of sun sign astrology, and everybody knows their sun sign, and everyone has this perception that you're just one zodiac sign, but then you learn that there's other planets in different signs of the zodiac and in different houses and that have different aspects once you start learning more advanced forms of astrology and realize that everybody's a combination of a bunch of different signs and placements and planets that creates a more complex picture. But nonetheless, sometimes there can be more dominant themes in a person's life or in a person's chart, and sometimes that can help provide like insight into the underlying meaning of the sign. So that's one of the reasons I want to do this series with astrologers that have some of those placements strong in their chart, because then I think that gives everyone has the greatest insight into their own sign or into the signs that are the most prominent in their chart. And so I thought you could help me sort of walk through and get a deeper understanding of, some of the positive and some of the challenging and everywhere in between sort of characteristics of Aries.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I'm happy to be your first case. Of course, as an Aries, I'm happy to be first at almost anything. Often there's a price that an Aries will pay for being first. There's a phrase in the computer world. People know what the leading edge is, but in the technology world, there's a phrase called the bleeding edge. That's where Aries hang out, because first isn't always easy.
Yeah, sometimes you've got to shed a little blood in order to do that, to make headway and to be the first into the breach in some instances. Although I guess that's getting a little ahead. So let me set the stage by first just showing this zodiac graphic from our zodiac poster that Paula Bellomini and I put together a few years ago that just shows the 12 signs of the zodiac and their basic characteristics or basic qualities in Western tropical astrology. And so the basic initial things that we need to know about Aries is that it's a masculine or diurnal sign, because it's an odd sign. It's the first, so it's number one, and therefore is an odd sign as opposed to an even sign. It's a cardinal sign. So out of the different quadruplicities or modalities, cardinal, fixed, and mutable, it's a cardinal sign because Aries falls at the very beginning of the season. It falls just after the vernal equinox, so just at the beginning of the spring season. It's a fiery or fire sign out of the four qualities of earth, air, fire, and water, the four traditional elements. And then finally, its planetary ruler is the planet Mars. So it's from these four primary qualities, I think, that we draw most of the major significations of Aries come from different combinations of those different qualities in astrology and then are interpreted symbolically. Let me show one more little image just to zoom in on that. And then finally, one other stats thing to show for Aries. This is the glyph for Aries, or the symbol for Aries that's up at the top, and it's supposed to sort of depict a ram's head.
It also shows kind of like a fountain. You know, when you look at things that are brand new, they germinate often in this kind of stem that bifurcates. And so in a way, if you think of a water spout coming up and then it separates, things come into reality as unity. There's a singularity at the beginning, but then as it grows, it complexifies, if that's a real word. I think it probably is. And I think that aside from being the horns on a ram's head, and of course Aries often lead by walking forward, by leading with their head, the fact of the matter is that that symbol also represents the gushing forth of id, as Freud would call it, the life force that comes out as singularity and then becomes more complex.
I like that. That makes sense. So yeah, you're right. It does look kind of like a sprout, also like a sprout that's just pushed through the ground initially, and it's just that first little initial inkling of like the full plant that's had to push through the dirt and the soil in order to get out above into the air.
So I have a friend someone I know who is a beekeeper. And and trust me, this is like a total astrological little digression here. And he has told me that when dandelions appear, bees forget whatever else they were pollinating, that dandelions are so demanding or they're so present with pollen that they become like drunk on dandelions. And as you may know, dandelions are, I think, maybe the only plant that is a natural plant that can go from flat, just poking up above the ground, to full flower in one day. That's how fast they grow. And they're a first of the spring plant. So dandelions are very much an Aries kind of a plant, if you were going to give it a planetary signature, if you will. I don't have it handy, but I wish I did. Can post it a link in the comments when this is posted later on. But I have photographs that I've taken with a macro lens of Aries, of dandelions, very, very, very up close. And all the inside of the dandelion before it goes to seed, they're all little stamens, and every stamen looks exactly like the Aries glyph. It's crazy. They all come up as one and then separate out. And when you look at that, it's like, what the heck? It's like and dandelions are very Aryan.
Okay, brilliant. Let's see, going back, there's the glyph. The name is Aries. Aries actually is Latin for ram. Like, it means, translating the Latin term was a translation of the Greek term, and it means the ram. That is the animal sort of totem that was originally associated with this sign of the zodiac, because each sign has a specific animal that's associated with it. And in terms of other stats with the ancient or so-called traditional essential dignities, Aries is said to be the domicile or the ruling sign of Mars. It's said to be the sign in which the sun is exalted, because Aries is the first month of spring in the northern hemisphere, and it's when the days start growing longer and the nights start growing shorter. Aries is said to be the fall or the sign of the depression of the planet Saturn, and it's said to be the sign of the detriment or the sign of adversity or exile of Venus, because it's opposite to one of Venus's ruling signs, which is Libra.
I have 3 of 4 of those planets, by the way. I have Mars, the Sun, and Venus, all
Nice.
in mid Aries.
Right.
So we can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. We're going to try to hit the full gamut of just about everything. The only other basic thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that in body parts, Aries is said to rule the head, based on this system where you start from the top of the body and then assign the signs of the zodiac going in order from first to last. And since Aries is the first sign, it gets assigned to the first part of the body, which is the head.
Mm-hmm. By the way, before we go on, I'd like to just come back to the word cardinal for a moment, because Aries, as the first of the cardinal signs, I think holds a special place. But many people don't realize that the etymology of the word cardinal, it actually derives, and I'm not sure I really thoroughly understand how etymology traces, because it's not always the words that sound exactly similar, but it is in fact the etymological origins of the word Aries comes from the etymological origin of the word cardinal comes from an old English word, henge, Henge, like in Stonehenge, which actually means hinge, and that a cardinal point is a hinge point. We often think of the cardinal points as initiation. They're the beginning of the 4 seasons. They're the beginning, of each of the quarters. They're the points from which the other points on the compass arise. But what's intriguing is that if you go back, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and you lived next door to the equivalents of a Steve Jobs, rather than inventing the iPad, he might have invented the hinge. We don't think of that as a great technology, but the idea to have a wall that is stable, Saturn, if you will, and to be able to open that wall and go through it, and then close it again and have that stable wall maintain its stability, was a huge technological move forward. And that the idea of cardinal signs being hinge points are very interesting. And of course, just as a quick aside, the cardinals in the Catholic Church were meant to be hinges that actually interacted with the public. And it's from the red costume, Aries red. We didn't make that association, but the red color of the cardinals' costumes actually is where the bird, the cardinal, got its name. So just a little fun diversion on that word cardinal, which really means a hinge, an opening to something new.
Right. Yeah. And that was a really important word in ancient astrology, because it also means, and the Greek word that it's connected to means pivot, because it's the turning point, the point in which something turns suddenly or is pivotal. And so you have this notion, I mean, it's tied in astronomically directly to the notion that Aries and the other cardinal signs are the point in which the seasons turn, and there's a turning or a change in the season, so that it switches from, in the case of Aries, from the winter season to the spring season in the northern hemisphere. And so there's a sudden, like a change or a pivot.
And that's what a hinge does. A hinge pivots. But in its pivot, the stability of the system is not lost.
Right. Yeah. So with that, that's a really good point, though, because this is something that 4 of our signs of the zodiac will all share in common, which is the 4 cardinal signs, which are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, is that they all fall at the very beginning of their respective seasons when the sun makes a definitive change, and there's a definitive change in the amount of heat and light during that part of the season. So in the spring season, it's at the point where once the sun passes the vernal equinox, the days start getting longer than the nights. And that is the sort of pivot point or the changing point in terms of our environment and atmosphere and just what's happening astronomically in the sky.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So from that, we get many of the basic significations of Aries, which have to do with things being initiated and initiating change in some way, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the word head is such an interesting word. You know, when you go to the head of the class or the head of the line, that's first. And so and again, often you can spot the person with the strong Aries influence in their chart. When they walk, they're like slightly hinged at the waist, and the head almost like they have the horns on a ram. The head, they lead with their head, they walk with their head forward. It's really interesting. Once you notice it, you can see it all over the place.
Yes, there's also two really basic things that are just a basic astronomical property or a symbolic property, like being associated with the head or being associated with the beginning of the season. And then what we're going to do throughout this series is those basic properties then get interpreted symbolically and will show up in different ways in a person's life, both sometimes in their personality or their personal characteristics, sometimes in their actions or the way they act, or sometimes in the way that certain events manifest in a person's life. Like, for example, they might happen more quickly or suddenly to some extent in a cardinal sign compared to, let's say, a fixed sign, which happened to fall in the middle of the seasons where things develop more slowly or more slow to develop.
Mm-hmm. You know, that is true. And yet, just because it's a cardinal sign doesn't mean that it's specifically focused on the present moment, which is the uniqueness of Aries. Because Cancer as a cardinal sign always has an eye in the rear view mirror. It's always holding on to some emotion from the past, the childhood, whatever. You know, Libra is always balancing the inner with the outer rather than just the what's going on for me in the present moment. And the Capricorn is always calculating about how it's going to get to where it's going to. Whereas, we'll get to this later on, I assume, but Ram Dass, who wrote the book Be Here Now, was an Aries, because Aries has to do with that fleeting moment that is the what's the right word? It's the Mecca, it's the ideal point of Buddhism, to be here now, to be in the present moment, which is uniquely never stable because it always immediately moves into the past.
Right. So, one of your primary slogans for Aries, what was that again?
Ready, fire, aim.
Okay. I like that because it packs several things into the same metaphor. And one of them that we'll just keep coming back to regularly, and I think that one of the dominant ones is Mars, and Mars being the ruler of Aries. And it's not, at least traditionally, is not the only ruler of Aries. Aries is ruled by Mars, and the other Mars-ruled sign is Scorpio. So I should have said, to clarify, it's not the only sign that Mars rules, but here in Aries, we're going to see one side of Mars and one expression of Mars. And then at some point, once we get to Scorpio, we'll see some other sides of Mars. But while there's some overlap because they're both ruled by the same planet, there's also a lot of distinct tendencies as well.
Yes, very much so. And the Mars in Aries is that sense of urgency of being in the present moment, where with Scorpio, there's always this sense of, where will this present moment lead? Where am I coming from? Where am I going to? I sometimes say that if an Aries, and I'm generalizing here, I'm talking pure Aries energy, if an Aries and a Scorpio have a fight or a debate, in other words, there's some interaction of conflict between Aries and Scorpio, the Aries has to win on the first blow. Because if it doesn't, the Scorpio will always win, because the Scorpio has the staying power that Aries doesn't. And yet Aries has that sense of intense, incredible power only in the present moment that Scorpio doesn't.
Yeah, the staying power, because it's a fixed sign of Scorpio versus Aries being a cardinal sign and having this amazing initial push and burst of energy that can sort of bulldoze or plow through anything at the beginning, but sometimes doesn't always have the staying power, or sometimes can get fatigued in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend who's a master chess player, and as a kid, I played a bunch of chess. I was never awesome, but I was pretty good. And this guy goaded me for years into sitting down and playing a game of chess with him. And finally, one evening I did, and I beat him. And he was like, he was beside himself. He was freaked out. And he said, "We're playing again right now." And I played him again, I would say about 4 or 5 times over the following months. And he beat me like in 15 moves every time, because my Ariesness was so intense in the moment and so forward, and he didn't realize what my style would be because I was erratic. I was in the moment. But I could never get away with that again. That's a perfect example of Aries energy against other energies. It can be brilliant in the moment, but it can be also be like a supernova. And I think that's one of the dilemmas of Aries energy, is how do you sustain it? It's why Mars is one of the reasons why Mars is exalted in Capricorn, because Mars in Capricorn finishes the job it starts. Mars in Aries, or Aries in general, would much rather start 10 jobs and let someone else finish them.
That's so funny. Yeah, that's a really good example, because I had a recent one of that where a friend of mine who has Aries placements challenged me to play like Mario Kart, and I was like, "Yeah, I'll beat you in Mario Kart. I haven't played it in 20 years, but I'm sure I'm still really good at it." And they just decimated me in the first few games, and that was the end of it. And I was humiliated. So I had to. But then over the next few days was like it was like a Rocky training marathon with like Eye of the Tiger playing in the background, and I'm just like practicing Mario Kart for the next several days. And then we had a rematch, and I had to take them down in order to even things out, as with all of my Scorpio placements. So your analogy of chess is speaking to me on a very personal level right now as a Scorpio.
Yeah, but I should add here, it's been said that chess is the greatest waste of human intelligence outside of an advertising agency.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, games, and that's actually one of our Aries people, I believe, is Gary Kasparov, who has Aries placements in the 5th house, which is like the place of games. And it's one of the things that's really interesting about the 5th house is that sometimes when those placements, when heavy placements in a person's chart do get channeled into the 5th house, they get channeled into things that otherwise other people might think of as just like a hobby or something like that that's not important, in this instance, like chess. But for him, he became Gary Kasparov with Sagittarius rising and Jupiter in Aries, with the sun also in Aries in the 5th whole sign house. He became the world champion at chess, at this game, and that became one of his primary things in life.
Yeah, and as an Aries, we look at his Mars in Leo, kind of reflective back at the 5th house. We normally think of gaming or competition like that. Aries can be competitive, but the 5th house and or Leo is often more associated with the play of the sport, if you will. And Gary Kasparov had certainly that in spades, although it might be wide to I was going to say it might be wide to consider this a grand fire trine. The fact that the Mars in Leo, the Sagittarius rising and moon, and that cluster of planets, well, the sun and Jupiter in particular, in Aries, really make this person someone who in the moment can be terrible. And I mean terrible in the sense of like, a terrible infant, someone who has the force and the power.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So you're focusing also on the fiery. So he has a huge dominance of fire placements in his chart. And that brings up one thing, was just us needing to focus on and unpack Aries as a fire sign and what it means to be fiery, since fiery is actually one of my major keywords for Aries. Or sometimes, like, if a person is like a real fireball as an expression, it can be like an Aries thing. But you're also bringing up another important thing we have to get into, which is that for everybody that has placements in Aries, it's going to be modified to some extent based on where Mars then is placed in the chart, because Mars is the ruler of Aries. And if, for example, in Gary Kasparov's chart, Jupiter and the sun are in Aries, that means they're partially depending on the ruler of that sign, Mars, for part of their expression. And
exactly.
Since Mars is placed in Leo, part of the expression of those placements is through the placement of Mars in Leo, so that you get a blend of Aries and Leo in this chart rather than something that's just like purely Aries placements.
One of the words that comes to my mind, because I've trained it to, that most people don't think of, is something that I got directly from Carl Jung. Carl and I were hanging out one day, and he said, "Rick," no, I'm kidding, but I got directly from his writing, and that is that in Jung's framework, fire is the sign of intuition. Now, most astrologers think of, oh, intuition, that's Pisces, but the thing about intuition is that intuition doesn't have a process of perception, sensation, logic, make a plan, and then do it. Intuition basically is a fully formed idea that is immediately turned into action. That a fire burns intuitively, meaning it doesn't think, well, should I go this way or that way? Well, that log's drier, but this tree is bigger and I can't. It just does. And so the idea of fire as intuitive is really an interesting concept. And it takes someone like a Gary Kasparov, and we'll see this in other charts, where fire signs somehow, the way they can be in the moment without having a process is sometimes based upon this high level of intuition that is they like a fire. They just know what they need to do to keep burning.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about this a lot, and I think part of it is there's another word that's like that, but might be closer, which is instinctual. That the Aries has an instinct and will go on instinct, but it's almost like an internal impulse of the instinct of knowing what to do versus, let's say, some water signs, which we might characterize as more intuitive or having emotional intuition or something like that. There's something different about the instinctual, the instinct to do things or the instinct to act that Aries has that sometimes guides them.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, I think that is very true.
Okay, so let's start getting into some keywords because I have a ton. One of the things that I did in thinking about this episode is I just put a call out on Twitter, and maybe I'll put a link to this thread because I can't cite everybody that turned in significations, but I wrote some of them down, and I was just like, what keywords do you associate with Aries? And a ton of different people responded, sending in all sorts of different significations that was really good and gave me a full range of different things to draw and different sides of things because different people have different takes on it. Some people are Aries themselves or have different Aries placements. Other people don't. And maybe some get along with that energy or others don't get along with it due to how their own chart is set up. So it's interesting seeing how some people perceive different things based on their own placements. One of the things that I came up with as I was trying to write down some of my own significations, though, is quick and zooming. For some reason, zooming around is one of my first things that I think of when it comes to Aries.
That's an interesting word because I think of zooming also as Gemini-ish because zoom doesn't necessarily have direction. But go ahead. I like that. Go ahead.
Just the idea of, because with Mars ruling the sign, Mars is really about movement and is about speed and quickness, as opposed to Saturn, which is slow and it slows things down and sometimes grinds things to a halt. And that's sometimes why, for example, this Mars-Saturn conjunction that we recently had, or the one that happened 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic when the lockdowns happened, that's sometimes why that energy of Mars-Saturn can be experienced as somewhat negative, because you get those two extreme tendencies of wanting to go very fast or wanting to something forcing you to go very slow, and it can grind things to a halt and hold back or cancel out all movement or create a conflict between them. But in unpackaging that, I think one of the underlying things that I keep coming back to as an archetype for Aries is the notion of movement and speed and quickness.
Yeah, and that speed of Aries, unlike Gemini, is almost instantaneous, at least in concept. It's been said that the shortest distance between two points is not a line, it's a thought. And in a way, although Aries is action, it's that there's this short distance between the idea of what's happening and where you want to get to that makes that sense of the present moment almost like expanded. It's like everything that's happening is happening right now. And so, yeah, it's movement at the speed of light, and certainly Albert Einstein had, some Aries influence in his chart. And so there's that whole sense of Aries being instantaneity, which can be perceived as very fast.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be really constructive, like striking while the iron is hot, for example, as an expression.
Oh, that's a good Aries line.
Yeah.
Strike and hot are both Aries words.
Yeah. But then sometimes there can be another side of that, which can be like impatience, like the person that wants to do something right now and doesn't want to wait in order to do it, so that you get sort of both sides.
And there's a price to pay often for too much unbridled Aries. And I think that that's associated with youth. I mean, I still have that issue in my life, but looking back to my childhood and teen years, there are certainly situations that I got myself into that had I stopped and thought for a moment, I would have realized maybe this isn't such a good idea.
Right. And I forgot to mention at the top of this, the date for this episode, just because I always try to include that, but it's April 10th, 2022, we started at about 1:08 p.m. In Denver, Colorado, with Leo rising and the sun right around the midheaven at 20 degrees of Aries. So I was we had some technical snafus for the original chart that we were shooting for a couple of days ago. But this is still nice that we're still in Aries season, and I'm going to try to record these episodes one a month with the sun going through each of those signs as we do it over the course of the next year.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to what you're talking about, so we talked a little bit about striking while the iron is hot, and then also some of the downsides of some of that, which can be impatience. But then going back to the positives, it makes me think of another saying, which is the early bird catches the worm. And that might be another Aries thing in terms of, being first at something, sometimes being a winning combination, or sometimes being successful as a result of being first and being the first one to take the risk at, being the first to do something.
Yeah, I think that one of the traits of Aries is, I was going to say not being afraid, but I'm not sure that that's quite correct. It's being afraid and not being resistant to facing the fear and pushing through it, of being the first one to do whatever, fill in the blank. One of the words,
courage or courageousness.
Yeah, there's a sense of, we associate Aries, two really good Aries keywords are pioneering and enterprising. Now, both of those words indicate that the person is doing something that other people haven't done yet. If you're an enterprising person, you can put pieces together and create something that has never been done before, or something that in some way is a combination of things that you have to figure out as you're going along. You can't be a pioneer and make a game plan. I mean, if you're a pioneer, as soon as you take that first step into the unknown, your game plan is survival. You may have skills that you've worked on. You may be adept at certain things that make you a better pioneer than someone else. And I'm not talking about just the Daniel Boones and John Fremonts, who were pioneers in the United States, who went into territories that were as of yet discovered, and they used their Marsy Aries energy to kind of to lead the way, like a scout would lead the way, would go where other people have not been. Captain James T. Kirk, in the Starship Enterprise, is just an absolute perfect archetype for Aries. What do? They go to places that have never been explored. But it's also the pioneers of intellect and the pioneers of ideas that are also Aryan, that are people who are going into places that are brand new. And for an Aries, that's exciting. It's exciting being somewhere where no one else has ever been. Whereas for someone else, that might be so threatening that they would rather go and take the tried and true. And I'm reminded of a William Blake line from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he writes that the road of genius is a crooked one, where that of an improver is straight. And I think that there's a sense of that Aries recklessness that is not a straight line, because the Aries person who may be the great pioneer may go and take 3 or 4 journeys that totally fail, that don't get to where they want to go until they actually get to where they want to go.
Right. Like you got to break some eggs in order to make an omelet, I think is the saying.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this brings up some other things. One of them we might get into now is there's a cluster of significations connected with Mars that have to do with like the warrior, the fighter, the leader, and one of them is also the hero. And for me, that's one of the best overarching or underlying archetypes for Aries, is the notion of the hero at its highest expression and the notion of the hero's journey, which is this sort of concept that's been developed over the past century by Joseph Campbell and other people, of this notion of there being this core archetype that shows up in many different myths from different cultures about what the sequence is in the development of a hero archetype and what kind of journey that they go through from simple origins to something more complex, to the person that we think of at the end of the story. So I have a little like snippet from Wikipedia where they're talking about Joseph Campbell's take on this, and it says the concept is that a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are then encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. So that's kind of a short version of it, but the long version of it is that there's a number of different stages and steps along the way in the journey, but that they, again, from another paragraph, it says that they begin in an ordinary world, and the hero must depart from the ordinary world where he receives a call to adventure, which is a very Aries type signification.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, with the help of a mentor, because the hero is often a younger type figure, and then which is another Aries type thing of like youth or youthfulness. It says the hero will cross a guarded threshold, leading him to a supernatural world where familiar laws and order do not apply. There, the hero will embark on a road of trials where he's tested along the way. So that's another like Aries thing, which is sometimes having setbacks or trials, like trying something initially and not necessarily succeeding. Then it says the archetypal hero is sometimes assisted by allies. As the hero faces the ordeal, he encounters the greatest challenge of the journey. Upon rising to the challenge, the hero will receive a reward or a boon. Campbell's theory of monomyth continues with the inclusion of a metaphorical death and resurrection. The hero must then decide to return with this boon to the ordinary world. The hero then faces more trials on the road back. Upon the hero's return, the boon or gift may be used to improve the hero's ordinary world in what Campbell calls the application of the boon. So this is all just from a Wikipedia page on the synopsis of his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. But I just like that notion of the hero. And then, of course, we've seen that show up in many different arts and culture type things. Like, for example, in Star Wars, where George Lucas drew on that for the figure of Luke in the very first Star Wars movie, and how he starts out as sort of like a humble moisture farmer on a desert planet, and then
apparently George Lucas had conversation with Joseph Campbell in crafting some of these figures, you know.
Yeah, right. So he was like drew on that explicitly in developing the figure of Luke, and then Luke, finds out all this stuff about his lineage and like goes on to be the hero and save the day, so to speak. And it's funny actually, because I was looking through my files, and the actor who even played Luke, Mark Hamill, has Jupiter in Aries, which is kind of a funny placement down there.
Yeah, I love it when that happens, when the person who's acting the part, we've seen this before. I think Alex Trenoweth just wrote a book on people who play parts that their chart actually supports.
So yeah, which is a major phenomenon. So when it comes to that, that's one of the highest expressions of the Aries archetype, I feel like, is the hero, like the
Hmm.
somebody that will fight and defend somebody, especially for a cause or for a reason, or will defend the downtrodden, or who will fight and sort of strike out and do what's right, even if it means going it alone and encountering hardships or difficulties in order to achieve or defend that which needs to be defended.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. All of that true. And I don't know if you mentioned the fact that Joseph Campbell was not only an Aries, but had Mercury, Jupiter, and Mars all in Aries too, just as a point of reference.
Yes, that's hugely important. You mentioned his chart and put him in our notes, and I think that's amazing that he had an Aries stellium. So he had
Hmm.
Libra rising, and he had
Yeah.
Sun at 5, Mercury at 6, Jupiter at 6, Descendant at 20, and Mars at 21, all in Aries. So the guy that developed this notion or had this observation about the hero's journey himself had a huge number of placements in Aries, which is
Well,
just
and the
beautiful.
cool thing about this is not just that he had the Mars in Aries, he went on the journey himself. You know, early on in life, he went off into a cabin up in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. People don't know that the first book that he wrote was a book called A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, which anyone who has any literary orientation knows is a book that was so complicated that most people just said this is gobbledygook, it's trash, it doesn't mean anything. And Joseph Campbell actually wrote a book that deciphers it like page by page by page, but he did it by going away and becoming a recluse and really going on his own journey. And what's fascinating about his chart is that the Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter are all within almost a quarter of a degree. They're that close. They are. It's actually, I think, 17 minutes of orb from the Sun to Mercury to Jupiter, and they're in his 6th house. This was his work. They're trying the moon in Leo in the 10th house, so he puts on the show, the huge, the man with 1,000 faces, and the PBS specials that he's known for. But it's the Sun and Mercury communication, and then Jupiter, the philosophy, but all in Aries. He made all this stuff up. No one had done this work before ever. That's a pioneer.
Right, for sure. So this is all sort of positive version. We're going to go back and forth because no sign and no placement is either all positive or all negative, and it can express in either constructive or destructive ways, and people can take it in different directions or even somewhere in between. It has to do with, like, the person's own choices. It has to do with the environment that they grew up in. It has to do with, and people can change and manifest different versions of the archetype at different times throughout their life, and can sometimes be not always just one version or another. But so that said, we have the highest expression of, let's say, the hero's journey or the hero archetype with Aries, but then also there can be the fighter or the military figure, or there can be the person that is instigating things that is not the hero, but is, like, let's say, like the villain or the person that's constantly starting
Yeah,
fights with
the
people.
villain or the
Or
bull or the bully, even the insecure person who is coming out of no strength at all, and then overcompensating for it and acting tough because of the fear of what it might be if people realized what a wimp or he or she were.
yeah, something that came to mind yesterday when I was writing on significations when it gets to that area was the notion of the Napoleon complex,
Yeah, yeah,
or the notion of somebody that has, like, an insecurity about something with them, and in order to hide or make up for that, they overcompensate by being overly aggressive or bossy or something like that.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, so that can be an issue to sort of pay attention to, or a weakness or a sort of blind spot in some instances. Is that sometimes there can be a sort of an insecurity that's masked or covered by a sort of aggressiveness, or a tendency to fight, or a tendency to try to dominate in some sense.
or even the notion of an Aries being pushy, not even necessarily physically, but Aries. One of the interesting things about Aries is that as the baby of the zodiac, it is unconscious in a very odd way. It's unconscious like two planets in conjunction have no perspective on one another. There's not an awareness because they're so close together. There is an unconsciousness to it. And the baby, who can be amused by their fingers and toes for hours, has no idea that the fingers and toes are part of their own being. They're like everything in the universe is part of the self, whether it's part of the self or not. And herein is an interesting thing about Aries' selfishness versus selflessness, because theoretically an Aries would be very selfish. Selfish because Aries is the sign of the self. It's the first sign. It's the I, me, mine. It's the baby who doesn't know that anyone else has any needs, so therefore it takes care of its own needs. But when you look at the developed Aries, you realize that they've included in their sense of self their loved ones, their children, their parents, their family, their country, some sense of a wider concept, so that in some ways they're still being selfish, but the self is so expanded that it becomes the Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence. I mean, you can't make that kind of stuff up. Aries is also the sign of freedom and independence. And you have someone like Jefferson who wrote that in some ways because of his selfishness of wanting to declare his independence, but he projects it out to a larger, wider audience that turns that selfishness into a form of selflessness. Just an interesting tweak.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that independence as being a really strong and important Aries keyword, as well as related ones like autonomy and having self-autonomy, wanting to be unencumbered, by other people or act, on their own, or being self-sufficient is another Aries keyword that's tied in with that complex.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that you see in people often develop over time. You see the youthful Aries, like a ram, being part of a family or a pack or a group. And then as the ram grows older and learns survival, then you see that lone ram on the top of the mountain, or standing alone, feeling or apparently looking like it doesn't need anyone else. And of course, everyone needs someone else. It's not quite that simple. But there is something about that sense of solidarity, aloofness, aloneness. Above it isn't quite right, but there's a boundary. That makes that Aries, I think, in a more mature stance, become more independent.
That makes sense. All right, so let's see other areas. One of them with the fieriness or the heat, the hotness, like the notion of it being a fire sign. Some of the other things that can come up with this can be things like anger, like that notion when you get really angry about something and you're just seeing red is another expression. Red is another color sort of associated with Aries.
Mars, the angry red planet, which is what it's referred to as.
Right. So anger, redness, blood. So notions of anger, though, sometimes quick to anger or being temperamental can be a side of Aries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know that I have anything to add to that other than it's absolutely true. One thing about the Aries anger, though, and this goes back to that concept of a baby. A baby, when it feels pain or discomfort, cries, yells, screams, gets angry, and then there's no trace left of it. As adults, we learn that we can't always do that. And so there's something about a raw innocence or immaturity even about an Aries kind of overreacting in some people's minds and getting angry. But then Aries as a sign, not that people don't have other influences, but Aries as a sign is not interested in carrying a grudge. Why? because a grudge refers to something that you're holding on to from the past. That's the Cancerian, I'd rather get even than get angry kind of a thing. Aries wants to blow the energy off in the moment, which can upset others, but the Aries is left feeling great because it expressed its anger and it's done with it. Boom.
Right. So it can become sort of furious, or there can be an initial like rage,
Yeah.
but it's something where they're eventually forgiving and the rage doesn't last necessarily, but eventually they get over it, as opposed to, let's say, again, like contrasting that with Scorpio, which is like a fixed Mars ruled sign where it's like if they get mad about something, they may hold on to it for like years or like decades.
Forever.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that's really good and really insightful. And one of the things we're doing here, I want to clarify, is we're talking a lot about this in a context of personality characteristics and traits and psychology. But through that, you can also understand some of the other ways that some of these archetypes may manifest in more literal situations, depending on the context. But because we're one of the most accessible ways to access the archetype is through the personality characteristics. So I just wanted to mention that briefly, because while most of our conversation will focus on that so that people can use it and understand it in a way that's more immediately relatable, because we're talking about archetypes, there can be many different ways that these things can manifest in the world in different situations once you understand the underlying dynamics.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's those dynamics that we see in people that help us understand all of the signs and planets, the archetypes for that matter. Give you a quick example in my life. I mean, obviously I'm more or wider than just an Aries, but there are certain things in my life that are quite Aryan. And I've been accused at various times in my life of being rude.
Mm.
Now, people who know me know I'm a pretty kind person, very kind. I am someone who will go out of my way to be kind when other people might just pass by a situation. However, I sometimes have been accused of being rude by people who I didn't even know I was interacting with. And that is it's a negative part of that Aries being in the moment, that you and I can have a conversation and I can just be going somewhere else in the conversation and not even give you any room to say what you were going to say. Or if you do, just pass it off and go back to what I was doing or saying, because of that whole self-directed notion of Aries, of getting to where it's going to without any distractions. And I've, been in social situations at conferences where apparently someone has said hello to me and then years later told me how rude I was when I didn't even remember the person saying hello to me. Now, I'm not saying that forgives me. I'm just saying that it's an Aries kind of a trait of being so focused on what it's focused on. And that's another thing that people sometimes skip over with Aries traits. The high level of focus is why an Aries can be such an intense warrior in the moment, because there is no past or future. It's everything is now in this moment. And if it doesn't fit into what I'm doing in this moment, it doesn't exist. But again, there's a personality interaction. Now, how does that translate to an archetype? It can translate into an archetype that might seem to be self-centered and uncaring, when that's not necessarily what's going on.
Yeah. So one of the words that's coming up as I hear you describe this is the word brusque.
Good word. Brusque, brash. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So brusque, and I was just looking up a definition of brusque, which I'm going to do several times during this, but marked by a rude or peremptory shortness. So curt, but underlying that it's not the rudeness itself, because the rudeness, I guess, is part of the side effect, where some people can experience that as brusque, but the thing underlying it is getting to the point. Getting straight to the point is one of the sayings, and bringing it down to a more practical level, it's that notion that in geometry, that the fastest way to get from point A to point B is a straight line, and Aries will take the straight line and the shortest line as their initial impulse. rather than, let's say, some other signs might take a more circuitous route where you go around and you look
Tell
at
a story. Tell a story.
yeah, or you look at the scenery or something, or you look stopping to smell the roses, whereas the Aries maybe wants to get more straight to the point, and that can come off as brusque, maybe as a side effect, but it's not always necessarily the underlying intention.
Yeah, I think that is. I think that is true.
So that brings up other things, though. Is like sometimes Aries can come off as sort of like rough around the edges, or can be rough around the edges for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking of some of the other keywords I was coming up with were things like a biker or a fighter, a warrior, a soldier. One of my favorite examples, for example, of astrologers that I know or knew was my friend Alan White. And I always use him as my like classic Aries rising example with Mars and Aries in a day chart, because he was this like, former soldier, special forces, ex-Vietnam veteran who also was an astrologer.
Yeah, I
And
never
when
knew whether to be scared by Alan or to be totally fascinated by his ability to know stuff that I had no idea about, It's like,
right, because he would show up to like conferences with his like, military, fatigues on, or regalia on, and he had this very gruff, brusque way of speaking with this loud, sort of like booming voice that could be very direct.
yeah.
And he was not one to avoid like using profanity and things like that. But sort of underlying that initial sort of impulse, or underlying that initial impression, was sort of softer, more thoughtful sort of person internally. And he had a lot of other stuff going on in his chart. But yeah, that notion of that sometimes Aries can be brusque. It can rub some people the wrong way. It can be off-putting.
Hunter S.
Sometimes,
Thompson is another good Aries energy. I think he had an Aries ascendant, and he pissed people off because he was just like didn't give a shit about what they thought or what they were what they wanted to say. He had his point to make, and he was going to make it.
yeah. So not being afraid to hurt somebody's feelings sometimes, in order to say what needs to be said or what they feel like saying. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we should say that what needs to be said isn't always what needs to be said. that one of the downsides of raw Aries energy is saying things that do not need to be said. That it's I can hear the therapist saying to me, "So why did you say that? Was it because you wanted the other person to know, or did you say it just so that you could feel better, about yourself?" And I think oftentimes, that Aries energy is, it can go out of its way to kind of make people angry or annoyed without even necessarily knowing it. But I think there's also sometimes a sense of knowing it and kind of liking it. That it's the finger prodder, who's going to poke until the person reacts somehow. And I think that people can do that.
yeah, and that can be like the rabble rouser, or the somebody that starts, kicks up dust, or starts problems by needling or like poking people, for example.
Chris Rock. Yeah, I know you were going there.
Right. Yeah, yeah. There's a good one. There's a little questionable thing about his birth data, but if the current one that we have is correct, he's an Aries rising with Mars in Virgo, which is really interesting because that's another example of how, especially with the rising sign, I think especially the placement of Mars in whatever sign it's located in will really modify the expression of the rising sign, since when Aries is rising, Mars is the ruling planet. And so you get more of a blend between the Aries and the Martian energy, or Aries and Virgo energy, as expressed by Mars.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So things said in the heat of the moment. We talked about the young thing already, and that can sometimes lead to other things like "born to be wild" was a phrase that I came up with, or "bad to the bone," that like song the notion of Aries can sometimes like being a little bit gruff, and sometimes like having that conception of themselves as gruff or putting that
Marlon
out there.
Brando,
Mm,
as in his earlier movies, I mean, he was the tough guy.
right, the tough guy. That's a good one.
And Marlon Brando, I think, is an Aries new moon. And yeah, there's a sense of other military people too. We shouldn't gloss over the fact that the perhaps most convincing of Michel Gauquelin's work was the idea that people who excelled in the military and in sports tended to have Aries ruling planet Mars in a sector of the chart in a house that was close to one of the cardinal points. And we have, soldiers like Colin Powell, who may not have spent time in fistfights, but as a military leader, used his Aries sense of working with conflict in a way that would be typically Aryan.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I'm glad you brought up the sports thing, because I think sports and sporty are very important and core, like Aries keywords, because you get some of that. Aries is very kinetic and is very about competition, but also sport and athleticism and being sort of embodied in the body, but doing it in a way of acting. And if you can do something where you're acting or you're exerting and a sort of explosion of energy, that very much fits in with that sort of archetype, and doing it in a way that's competitive.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of instances where Shaq O'Neal kind of exuded that. He had Mercury, Venus, and Aries rising, where he kind of went out of his way to be gruff, and yet, because Venus was there also, there's a part of him that underneath that is a lot sweeter than he can appear, but he can use that size and physical prowess to kind of to bully a situation, to push it around.
Right. Let's see. Other things, I think defiant can sometimes be an Aries keyword, or even irreverent. Irreverence, possibly one that can be tied in with that a little bit, in the rebelliousness to some extent, or not being afraid to, as we said earlier, hurt somebody's feelings, but also to break away from something in a more positive or constructive expression that needs to be defied, like defying an oppressive authority figure or something like that.
Che Guevara, the
Right.
revolutionary. Yeah, I think that there's a sense of wanting to take on power, part for the sport of fighting. There's that sense of being engaged, where that Marsy energy comes to the surface, that I think becomes important for Aries. I think that works. I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, so maybe in needing something to fight one way or another, needing a way to express that energy and that impulse to fight something, and that can be sometimes constructively expressed if they're able to find a cause, or a good cause or constructive cause, or sometimes can be destructively expressed if they're just fighting needlessly or constantly starting conflicts with people, or even bullying somebody, as you said earlier.
Yeah, someone who kind of exudes that Marsy Aries energy. I don't think she's a sun sign Aries, but I think Angelina Jolie, who, although may be a character who is known for her physical beauty, is also known for her leading roles as a powerhouse of a woman. You don't want to mess with this person.
Yeah, as an action star.
As an action star. And so, although the charts up I see is that although she's a Gemini, with her Mercury in Gemini, so her use of words is certainly well developed. Her Moon, Mars, Jupiter are all around, and Jupiter closely conjunct her midheaven, all in Aries, and that Mars in Aries is like a powerhouse. This is not a woman that you'd, want to be engaged in a battle with.
Yeah, and doing action movies and being seen as kind of like a badass, which is
A
another
badass. Yeah.
Aries type signification. And interestingly, with those 10th house placements, one of her early roles that she did was when she played Laura Croft in the Tomb Raider movie. And I
Yes.
think part of her story that I've used her as a 10th house example before is this was one of her first experiences having exposure to another country that was war torn. And she ended up then devoting a lot of her work and efforts in her career outside of her movie roles to trying to help people, especially from war-torn countries, who were struggling with that, and to do like humanitarian aid efforts. And that's something that I'm constantly impressed and surprised by, that sometimes when people have difficult placements in their chart, it can manifest as them trying to help out people that are in difficult positions that are described by those placements.
Yeah. Well, and she also has some Cancerian, stuff also that kind of gives her that sense of caring more than people think she might. What comes across, is the Aries and maybe even the Gemini, but that Cancer is really there and shows up as someone who is a caring and loving person.
Right, for sure. Let's see. So going back to, there's some uh, competitive things. Never backing down from a challenge is something. Like I think of Aries. Sometimes I think of like Marty McFly in the Back to the Future series
Ooh, yeah.
whenever in the series somebody, he's like trying to back out of a conflict and he knows he shouldn't, but then when somebody calls him chicken, he can't back down from that challenge and he has to take them up and do the race at that point, because it sort of is connected with his ego in some sense of nobody's going
Right.
to challenge him and he's not going to walk away from a challenge in that way.
Right. Right. True. Yeah, that whole idea of not wanting to be seen as weak, I think, is really what the issue is. And that fear of being seen as weak then leads to the overcompensation. Tom Petty is a good example of that. Although he was a Libra with a pile of planets in Libra, he had Aries rising. And, his famous song, I won't back down. You can lead me to the gates of hell, but I won't back down. That is such an Aries in your face. And interestingly enough, as Libran and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Nice, a person as he was, he had this kind of, again, we're back to the badass image, the leather jacket and the kind of the toughness of appearance. And that the album title, I think that song was from, was "Damn the Torpedoes." It's like, I won't back down. And the story is that he allegedly wrote that song while being deposed by attorneys that had to do with who owned his material, and they were, in LA, they were high level entertainment attorneys deposing him, and he's sitting there in the deposition with this rather large knife in a black leather jacket, cleaning his nails with this knife, basically not giving an inch. So there's that Aries kind of like, tougher than nails appearance when he really maybe felt differently on the inside.
And you mentioned a knife. That's always been a Mars keyword.
Sharp
but
edges.
Also,
yes.
yeah, and sharpness, which then has many different meanings, or a sword is another good Mars type thing. Yeah. And then going back, the competitiveness, wanting to be a winner, like wanting to be number one, as again, probably an extension not just of the competitiveness, but the notion of Aries being the first sign and the notion of being number one reoccurring in many different ways through the archetype.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, as you were talking about, I mean, the whole idea of the knife and or a bullet, there's a sense of Mars relating to Aries as penetrating. And even in the sexual act, which can be associated with the Martian assertion or aggression, there's this sense of a tool that penetrates, which actually can be the mind. And I think sometimes people forget that Aries isn't just a physical warrior, that the Aries can be an actual intellectual warrior, someone who fights for their ideas, whatever they may be. I think of Rachel Maddow, for example, who is a sun in Aries, and I think that's even on her midheaven, if I'm not mistaken. And the fact that she uses her intelligence to actually fight for her convictions, but I can't imagine her in a physical, fracas. It just doesn't. It doesn't fit who she is.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. So sometimes coming out intellectually, other times it's like the Aries energy. If it was in the 7th house, it could come out in relationships, or if like Venus was there or something like that. Sometimes you can be attracted to that energy in your life, and that energy can show up in other people in terms of who you attract or the type of people that you gravitate towards.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it's like the person that's like, interested in the guy with the leather jacket, or the rebellious person who's mysterious, that looks rough around the edges or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's all. I think that's true. One other thing that just popped into my mind, which I don't think we've even touched on, which is also absolutely an Aries trait. We talked about the risk taking in the concept of enterprising or pioneering, but we didn't use the word gambling. And, gambling is really just a form of risk taking. And I knew this gentleman, a very well-known person in the business world, who is an Aries with a Saturn-Mars conjunction in Cancer. I think 1946-ish or somewhere in there. And he had several companies that he started, grew too fast, bankrupted, and fell apart until he basically figured out his way of approaching things and built a company that became a multi-million-dollar company in the area of medical foods, kind of products that were not like dietary supplements, but that were food that were still basically medically oriented. And the reason I'm bringing him up is that he and I were once on our way to Vegas for a conference that we were attending. And I said, so do you gamble? And he looked at me, he goes, "Oh, absolutely, but not with money in Vegas. I gamble with real life situations." Nice. And it was such an Aries thing to say, because as you look at his life, that's really what he did. And then you have real gamblers, like people like Pete Rose, who lost their place in being in the Baseball Hall of Fame, regardless of what a great player he was, because he was found guilty of gambling. Aries ascendant.
I love that you brought that up, because so the risk taker, but also the daredevil.
The daredevil, the Evel Knievel type person. I don't even know his chart.
That's who I'm about to bring. That's who I'm about to bring up, because we actually do have a time chart, and he's one of my favorite ruler of the ascendant examples, because Evel Knievel had Aquarius rising with Saturn as the traditional ruler of the ascendant in Aries in the 3rd house of short distance travel. And of course, he famously, would do these death-defying stunts where he would drive a motorcycle off a ramp and like jump over like a chasm or a bunch of cars or things like that. And he was constantly, he's the archetype, at least in like the late 20th century, like daredevil figure that people think about when they think of that idea of like risking your life to do a stunt or something like that.
Yeah. And let's see, you have his chart up, do you?
Yeah, so it's right here. It's Aquarius rising with Saturn at 13 Aries.
Yeah, Saturn in Aries.
In the 3rd whole sign house. And what's funny, and the other reason I use it, is that Mars, the ruler of the 3rd house, is in Virgo in the 8th house of death. And he was doing like death-defying stunts and defying death constantly.
Which is kind of a Mars-Neptune thing of like, this death isn't real kind of a thing.
The illusion,
and also the Saturn in Aries. I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead. I had an Aries moment. I was interrupting you.
No, no, I was just tacking onto what you said, maybe like the illusion of it being a death-defying stunt with Mars there conjunct Neptune, that maybe the illusion sometimes was like more than the actual risk or something like that.
Yeah. But even the Aries in the third house, which, is arguably a motorcycle ride, accelerating to a high speed and flying off into the air, is a
Right.
Gemini third house short trip, very short trip. But with Saturn there, it's like, what's the boundary? Can I push this boundary a little further? And Saturn in Aries, I think sometimes does that because they find that boundary and then they want to lean into it. They want to push it a little bit further.
Yeah. And for those of our younger people who don't really know who this is, just for reading from the Wikipedia, it says he was an American stunt performer and entertainer. Over the course of his career, he attempted more than 75 ramp-to-ramp motorcycle jumps. He was inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame in 1989 and died in 2007.
Yeah, he did some crazy shit, like things that were like, and I'm not sure he did this, but like taking a motorcycle jump across the Grand Canyon, things that only stupid people would do. And the amazing thing is that he didn't die from any of those things. He died from, I think, lung cancer or something.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great example just of the risk taker, the daredevil,
Which is a
somebody.
form of gambling. It's a form of gambling with one's own body. It's, yeah.
Right. So it can also be audacious, bold, um, plucky, or intrepid, or other keywords. Sometimes spontaneous, like spontaneity can sometimes be an Aries thing.
Well, and spontaneity is simply the idea of be here now. Spontaneity is there's a concept in Buddhism that has to do with enlightenment, which we kind of think of as, oh, this wonderful state. In some forms of Vajrayana Buddhism, enlightenment is like a fierce warrior state, because being in the present moment where there's no memory of anything in the past and no anticipation of anything in the future, that's really dangerous. It's they call it riding the razor's edge, and in a way, that sense of not only Ram Dass, who was an Aries and wrote about the power, or wrote about, Be Here Now was a book that he wrote, which became, kind of keywords of the 1960s of, the whole, hippie revolution, Be Here Now. But then later on, someone like Eckhart Tolle, who wrote a book called The Power of Now. And again, we're talking about spontaneity happens when the focus, and again, a key word for Aries is focus. It's slightly different than the word intention, which is a Leo word, because intention is focus that carries through, that holds its position, that fixed sign Leo holds on to that focus. Aries is about focusing right now, which is spontaneous. It's in the moment.
The immediacy of the moment.
The urgency of the moment. Yeah.
Mm.
And that sense of that not being a gentle place, because it's very dangerous when you don't have any anticipation of what's going to happen in the next moment. It encourages risk taking.
Right. I love that. Okay. So sometimes that can be one of the ones I had a question mark around was like trendsetter in terms of being the initial person to do something or being first to do something and taking that risk in the initial moment in the present.
Yeah, I was the first astrologer.
Right.
That gets back to the Aries connection with now. It's the Aries person is the first person on their block to have a hula hoop, a yo-yo, a skateboard, whatever the current trend or fashion is that's coming in. Aries has this like antenna that goes up and can read the zeitgeist of the moment. Again, I'm going to come back to that intuition word. They don't think about it. They just intuitively go, this is exciting. This is new. This is now. And I think new is another keyword for Aries that we didn't necessarily touch on. The new year, the new look, anything that is new has that Aryan sense. And so, yeah, definitely trends are things that in the long run may be unimportant. Lady Gaga, perfect, good example.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Lady Gaga's chart because she's a sun in Aries with the sun right on the midheaven, and also Venus in Aries in the 10th house. And especially early on, a lot of the way that she made a name for herself was with her fashion, her like really progressive or new, or sometimes like avant-garde, like fashion stuff, like wearing like a meat suit or stuff like that to a fashion event, and really pushing the boundaries of things by being like the first to do something.
And look at that Venus in Aries trine Uranus, the person who is not only reflecting the modern trend, but maybe even creating it, being slightly ahead of the curve with the Uranus pulling it into the future. And yet the Saturn trining the midheaven and sun, it's somehow she does it and she's not flaky. I mean, there's something about her that if someone else did it, you just write them off as a, crazy person who's doing weird shit. And yet when she does it, somehow it's a lot more real and stable because she has the stuff, the Saturnian substance behind it to make it real.
Yeah, that's a funny distinction then that you're bringing up of like Aries and being the first to do something versus Uranus being just kind of weird or that which is eccentric in some way, and that there can be like overlap between those, but there's somewhat separate sort of ideas or archetypes.
Yeah, they are. They work well together, but they're not the same thing.
Right.
And it's kind of why Aries, and Aquarius are sextile by sign. There's something about that seems to take, in the modern sense, Uranus related to Aquarius. I know in a traditional sense, not. But there's that sense of them working together, but there is a difference. They're not the same thing. They're not the same thing.
Right. Let's see. A couple other significations are written down were like malcontent or braggart, possibly sometimes. What do you think?
I think we touched on that a little bit.
Okay.
A braggart's like a bully. It's an intellectual bully. It's someone who is saying I'm better than, I'm bigger than. There's that energy that comes back to self. That kind of is narcissistic. Not that all fire signs or all Aries are narcissists, but there's that sense of making my reality more important than your reality.
Yeah. So braggart, the definition on Google, it says a person who boasts about achievements or possessions. So maybe the one, what's the expression? Like a sore winner, like the person that wins, but then like rubs it in your.
I never heard that before. That's a good line.
Well, I've heard the way sore loser. Everyone's heard that, but I don't know if sore winner is like the reverse of that, or if there's another phrase.
It's great. I love it. It's good.
One who gloats over a victory is what the definition says. So that's pretty good. Is the not just the one who wants to be number one and achieves number one, but then once they get there, sometimes maybe the shadow side can be to like kick downwards and to sort of like rub it in the faces of those who weren't able to reach that level.
Yeah, although this person has no planets in Aries, Donald Trump has Mars rising in fiery Leo, and that's there. He does carry that kind of energy, I think, at times, maybe at all times.
Yeah. Let's see, other things: insistent, bulldozer, simple sometimes, which I thought was an interesting. There can be a simplicity sometimes to Aries, or a single-mindedness.
Single-mindedness is, I would personally, not that I think simplicity is a word that can be interpreted as a negative thing, but I think that simplicity is more of a Taurian energy, that Taurus is keep it simple. And yet the Aries can seem simple like a Taurus when it is highly concentrated or focused. When it is focused, I don't think it's being simple. I think it's being focused. And maybe there is a simplicity to it. Maybe I'm just cutting words up too finely. But I like to reserve simple for that sense of simple pleasures, simple life, simple, back to basics that we normally refer to as Taurian, not Aryan energies.
Yeah,
That's
for
just
sure.
me.
Basic is a good Taurus keyword, especially in like the modern like slang usage of like that person's really basic can be a good Taurus keyword. So I understand where you're going. That makes sense there. Let's see. Other things I wrote down: playful, lunging, like lunging at something is a funny Mars and
Well,
appropriate.
yeah, and that word lunging also comes back to it's for Aries. There's a delicate balance where assertion becomes aggression. The two words actually mean the same thing, but there's a different quality or a different level of amplitude. If you're too assertive, you become aggressive.
Right.
And if you're too aggressive, that's when you're thrusting, when you're penetrating someone else's boundaries as an uninvited guest or potentially uninvited guest.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that those are good words for Aries. That it gets back to being pushy. It gets back to being pushing yourself or someone else into a situation, goading someone, to do something is a way of pushing them rather than pushing yourself. But I think even the drive for self-motivation, for a highly focused reason can certainly also be an Aries type thing that drive. I mean, it doesn't have the discipline that Capricorn or Saturn does without a Capricorn or Saturnian influence. But boy, I think that it can be incredibly self-motivating.
Yeah, for sure. And I think so much of that and what you're talking about has to do with the interplay, the constant interplay between Mars and Venus and being like the other side of the coin. For example, in like the domicile rulership scheme of like Aries and all of its significations being on the other side of the coin or the opposite end of the zodiac from Venus and Libra, or for another pair with the same similar dynamics is like Taurus, which is ruled by Venus, and Mars, which is ruled, or Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars traditionally, and that you get some of those same dynamics, and that can also be sometimes the reason why Mars people can get themselves in trouble is that delicate balance between the hunt and the chase, and Mars often liking the hunt, or a hunter being another like Aries type archetype. But that sometimes there can be a delicate balance between those two, and if it gets upset and you go too far in one direction, it can be problematic, or some difficult, tricky things can come up.
Joe McCarthy, McCarthyism in the 1950s, is someone who had an Aries ascendant and Saturn there. And this was a guy who was quite formidable at his height of power, and yet he abused it. He pushed, he was a politician that in some ways foreshadowed our current situation in politics, where people can be less politically motivated and more power pushy motivated. And he certainly did that. He's a good example of that bully. People did not want to stand up to him and did not want to face him.
Right. So for those that are not familiar with this, so it's about he was the one that started like the Red Panic or the Red Scare, where he was like he was a politician in the U.S. that was accusing people of being like communist or being anti-American, and started like a witch hunt basically for that, which led to like attacking and defaming and persecuting a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well said. Another person who's like that, but wears it so differently that he not only gets away with it, it in some ways makes him endearing to us. And that is Aries David Letterman, who also can not so much bully, but be that in your face yeah, I mean, I think David Letterman might have been the first person on TV to actually do this to the camera and come and, like come right in and be in your face. And I think that I've seen him do that with guests where he got onto something and it was like you couldn't settle him down. He would keep coming back around to that concept again and again and again. And he had Sun and Mars in Aries. It's an untimed birth, but we do know that, the Sun was obviously exalted and Mars in its domicile. And so that's another interesting one. But unlike McCarthy, he did it in a way that was funny, and most often he got away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I was more of a, at least in the 90s, I came in late, so I didn't see the earlier part of Letterman's career, but in the 90s, I would always watch Leno mainly. I was more of a Leno guy, but Letterman always seemed like he had this edge to him. Like a lot of his conversation and his jokes and stuff had this like needling or this edge to them, which was subtle, but it was there in terms of his style of like interaction with guests and stuff.
And I think as a youth in his earlier shows, it was much more predominant. He was much more a caricature of himself in his earlier years than he was when he settled into his role as established.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And I mean, it's funny as it brings up the other guy. My more favorite of the late night people in the like late 90s and 2000s was Conan O'Brien, who was a sun in Aries and Jupiter in Aries.
With flaming red hair.
Right. And was much more of the Jupiterian type version of that Aries archetype, where it was much more good-natured, but also breaking new ground and intrepid. And he was kind of like off on his own in this late show that was super late at night, and he could just do whatever he wanted. And so they would try new things. And sometimes it would be kind of wacky and kind of zany, but it was also always in more of a good humor or good fun type thing. It was
he had this self-deprecating thing that he really used quite well to disarm people against the feeling like they were being bullied in some way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. His jokes were never like at the expense of somebody else necessarily.
They were often at the expense of himself. I mean, he was someone who really did that. You would never see, you would never see a Johnny Carson or a Jay Leno do that in the way that he did.
That's really funny because maybe that his Mars is actually placed in Leo in the 12th house, and it's funny because the 12th house is traditionally said to be the place of self-undoing, which is like such a weird and sometimes abstract signification that I would read books early on and wonder what that even meant practically speaking. But it would be funny if that self-deprecation was coming from that Mars in the 12th house placement.
Yeah, interesting. Although I have to say that I've given that concept a lot of thought over the years, and I find it interesting that historically, the 12th house being so difficult because it is the house of our self-undoing. And in modern times, we look at the 12th house often as being the place of spiritual connection. And and you look at some of the modern religious and or spiritual practices, and they're practices of undoing the self, and so that self-undoing can happen either to someone who is repressed or unaware of their own stuff, and they end up in an institution, a hospital, a jail, whatever. Those are all forms of self-undoing. Or you can look at the person who in their early teenage years begins fasting, meditation, and processes of yoga and awareness like that. And those are all undoing the ego, self-undoing, conscious or unconscious. Interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I'm looking through our significations because it's a lot of jumble and we've kind of jumped around. So I'm trying to see if
like an Aries should. I mean, we had a plan and we wouldn't say we disregarded it, but we attacked it. Good Aries word, attack, a good Aries word. We attacked it in a way that we took whatever the most direct route was from wherever we were at each moment.
Yeah, ready, fire, aim. I think
ready, fire, aim.
Very beginning, and that's kind of how we wanted to set this up because this is the first show and I wasn't fully sure about a structure, but I realized we just needed to do it and then see how it went, and we would find the structure along the way, and that's very much in keeping with the Aries season and the
Chris, while we're looking for the next words in the spirit of just ready, fire, aim, there are a couple of pieces that I would love to read that I think are interesting because they take a different approach, but they're both short. One of them is from one of my favorite books by Ronald Davison, British astrologer, was president of the Lodge, developed what we call, relationship charts, where we use midpoint charts, a brilliant astrologer. But this book, which is out of print and sometimes very expensive and difficult to find, I think is one
Astrology.
Just titled Astrology.
Okay, Astrology by Ronald C. Davidson.
Yep. And in it, he traces through the cycle of the zodiac in a very interesting way. And he says, let us now trace the cycle of experience as it is depicted in the zodiac so we can get a better idea of the 12 phases of manifestation with which we identify ourselves according to the nature of our horoscope. The cardinal fire sign Aries represents the first cause, the life principle, pure spirit, God the creator, the resurrection, outrushing force whose impetus is irresistible. And I would also add unrepressible, or irrepressible, whatever that word would be. Here, here the accent is on unfettered activity, primitive self-expression, the joy of being. Those who identify themselves largely with Aries therefore see themselves as leaders and pioneers. They seek activity, often an adventurous kind, and manage to pack more experience into one lifetime than natives of some of the other signs might do in 2 or 3. Just a short little blurb. It doesn't say anything that we haven't touched on in some way, but it kind of puts it together. And also the fact that he relates this to the expression of unconscious urge and godhood. The word, here's a good word we didn't touch on, and that a good Aries word, and that is enthusiasm. Excitement. When an Aries gets charged up about something, it becomes enthused. And the word enthusiasm comes from the Greek entheos, which is with God. And when we're enthused, there's no separation between the divine that's coming in and our expression. It's like the artist who gets out of the way to do what his, her, or their art is. It's not Rick Levine doing this. It's something coming through me, and that is very much an Aries kind of a thing, entheos, with God enthusiasm.
Yeah, Aries are definitely very high energy. That's a good phrase for Aries.
Well, high energy when they can be, because obviously, for every high energy enthused Aries there's another Aries who can be repressed or suppressed and therefore not in touch with that energy. Remember, we're talking archetypes with spectrums, so we can be on either side of that spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. So energetic, also short bursts of energy. When you were talking and reading that quote, it made me think of the Big Bang and just that initial, things starting from a single point and then just exploding, and suddenly, the universe is created in that initial explosion, or even just the initial spark of the flame of a candle when it first starts, or something like that.
I've been accused of being a Big Bang. Where'd he go? What happened? The other thing that I wanted to read, and we mentioned her. I think we mentioned her.
Can I make a segue?
Please go ahead. Go.
One
sure.
thing we haven't talked about is Aries is a very passionate sign, and I don't know if that's something we've left out so far. The passion of not just Mars, but also that interplay between Mars and Venus a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that Venus is debilitated in Aries, and my Venus is very close conjoined to Mars in Aries. And I intellectually can read and see what those things mean, but I really like my Venus in Aries because I know what I like and what I don't like instantaneously. And also I am totally willing to change my mind when I learn something about what I either liked or didn't like at first. But there's that sense of Venus in Aries and Venus and Mars working together. We're talking martial arts. The word martial arts in some ways is Mars and Venus. And we forget that although we think of martial arts as physical fighting, there's also mental martial arts. There's again that idea of debate or of chess as a type of martial art, if you will. And so we can assert ourselves in a beautiful manner is I guess where I was going, Mars, Venus.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also the physicality, there's a physicality to Mars signs and to some extent Venus signs, and there's the give and the take, and that's the interplay between Mars and Venus and the old, philosophical, going back to the early Western philosophical Greek tradition of love versus hate as being these two polar dynamics or opposites, or that
Hmm.
which brings something closer versus that which pushes something away. But there's this physicality to Mars and to some extent Venus, and maybe that's what connects to some extent to the notion of passion, being passionate, or yeah, even the sort of athleticism involved in sometimes like lovemaking or having sex
Can we
as
use the
something.
word? Can we use the word adrenaline?
Adrenaline, okay,
Again, we come
that's
back to
one.
red. It's the difference between animal and vegetable. It's been said, and I think that part of the ancient tradition that Mars ruled the animal kingdom and Venus ruled the vegetable kingdom. I like to call it queendom. But that the difference between animals and vegetables largely is the difference between hemoglobin and chlorophyll. And hemoglobin and chlorophyll actually structurally are very similar, except hemoglobin has iron at a place in its structure where in chlorophyll it's copper and manganese, which is why chlorophyll is green. We think oxidated copper is green, and chlorophyll being green, and where did I go? Hemoglobin being red, and so that the adrenaline releases something into our bloodstream that makes us more passionate. Whether we love or hate, whether we're fight, flight, or it's still, there's that sense of in the moment where it becomes more excitable, and certainly passionate.
Yeah, and you left out a word there, but I think it's a very important word because we covered this as one of our core words, one of our best words that we could come up in the Mars episode that I did last summer. That was very appropriate as the word "fuck" as a Mars word. I can't
I
think of a
just
good
dropped
planet.
it out of respect for someone who might care, and I'm not adverse to using it.
Yeah, yeah.
Flight, fight, or fuck.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I apologize to any audience members that are not ready for that, but I want to be able to have that type of discussion so we can speak openly and freely when we're talking about archetypes and things like that. But I think that then also becomes a very important Mars and Aries word and signification in the way that it can be used as a multifaceted different thing that can be positive or negative depending on the context.
Right. And again, in the traditional use of that word, we come back to that sense of Aries and Mars as penetrator, as asserter or aggressor, whether there was an invitation or not.
Right. Yeah. And that being like a necessary process, but a double edged sword in terms of that it can go either way.
Hmm.
And then you can also, even other uses of it, like metaphorically, like telling somebody to fuck off is like a Martian and an Aries type thing of telling somebody to go away or get lost or something is sort of pushing something away or pushing something outward.
Yeah, it reminded me when I worked for years with an astrologer who's now passed. I know you knew Jeff Jower, and some of the other people here might. Jeff passed away about 5-6 years ago. Um, Jeff used to we taught a lot together around the world. And Jeff used to say to me, he goes, "I've never seen anyone who is so able to dismiss someone in a way where the person doesn't mind or doesn't fight back.
Hmm.
It's the fuck off." And Jeff would say that was a function of Mars in Aries, because and I've never even noticed this. I'm not even saying that this is true, but I'm saying Jeff would say this often, that I had the ability to define a boundary. Nope, we're not
Hmm.
going there. Or nope, not now. Or you need to be quiet if you're going to stay in this class, or whatever it is that is basically a fuck off kind of a saying, but it's about establishing boundaries. And that's what Mars in anger has a very important purpose. And when used constructively, what its purpose is to create a boundary.
Right.
We think of Saturn as the planet of boundary, but Saturn and Mars together really do that in different ways.
Yeah, because it's like this energy that extends outwards and pushes things away from it if necessary, which can sometimes be a necessary process, but also brings up that necessary process of setting boundaries, but also Mars sometimes having this tendency, in Aries having this tendency to transgress boundaries, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the context in the scenario.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What was before I interrupted you for that whole segment, you were going to read another passage from another book?
Yeah, I was someone who actually was an Aries, with Venus conjunct her sun, and Chiron in Aries also. This particular person had Mars rising in Gemini, and I'm speaking of Linda Goodman, who may have been the most popular astrologer who ever lived. I'm not really sure, but
I think she was actually, there was a later birth time that was found, and she's actually an Aries rising.
An Aries rising. Oh, okay.
Sure,
I don't doubt it. Regardless, she certainly was a sun sign Aries, born April 9th, 1925. And she wrote a book on sun signs called Linda Goodman's Sun Signs. That was one of the best-selling books of all times, selling enough copies that it warranted her being the first author to command a 7-figure advance for her subsequent book. But in the book, in her sun sign astrology book, she has how to recognize an Aries. And she was rather witchy in her writing, in her ability to simplify and make things be real, or make things seem real. And she wrote this. There's a leading little piece here that she wrote a lot of poetry. And this says, "They would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds." It's an interesting take, because it's that part of Aries that has to do with that risk taker and its rebelliousness, which we didn't really talk about it as radical rebellious. Well, we did in a sense of being feisty and pushing back. But she goes on to say, "Have you recently met an unusually friendly person with a forceful manner, a firm hand clasp, and an instant smile? Get ready for a dizzy dash around the mulberry bush. You've probably just been adopted by an Aries, especially if you found it a little tough to take the lead in the conversation. Is he committed to some idealistic cause and angrily defending the underdog? That figures. Male or female, these people will fight for what they feel is an injustice on the spot, and they're not bashful about voicing their opinions. The ram will talk back to a traffic cop or an armed gangster with equal vigor if either one happens to annoy him. Of course, he may regret it later, but caution won't concern him in the heat of the moment. Aries people come straight to the point with no shilly-shallying." It goes on, but it kind of like sets the stage in a way that I think few people do in their writing for describing that energy. So I wanted to share that.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that that Linda Goodman had not just the sun and Venus in Aries, but possibly the ascendant. And I've used this as an example of the ruler of that ascendant, Mars, was placed in Gemini in the 3rd house. And she just had this amazing way with words and amazing way to write, and became hugely successful as an astrologer over it. It was like probably the biggest selling astrology book ever. Even though astrology has been going on for thousands of years, I don't know if, it's sort of between like her and Ptolemy in terms of book sales, but her book was printed, like sold millions and millions of times, that she became easily just one of the most successful astrology writers ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really really good. All right, going back to my outline, one of the things that when you were reading that quote from her that made me realize that we didn't dwell on very much is just we talked about the difference between, and we've come back to a few times, the difference between Aries and Scorpio a few times. But one of the major things here, just in terms of the difference between, and we don't have to get into a whole discussion about, there's a lot of talk recently about whether the traditional designations of like masculine and feminine to the signs for the even and odd signs are still appropriate, or whether that's too tied in with complicated issues of gender and
Yeah.
other astrologers. For example, Chani Nicholas prefers to use diurnal signs for the odd signs and nocturnal signs for the even signs, which is also a traditional designation. And other astrologers, Austin Coppock prefers to use like yin and yang from the Chinese philosophical tradition. But one of the things, regardless of what you use, I think there's a notion in modern psychology of like extroversion versus introversion. And I think we could say pretty easily with a lot of the keywords we've been using here so far that Aries tends to be the more extroverted sign.
Sure.
Whereas let's say by contrast, Scorpio might be a more introverted sign or expression of the Mars archetype.
Yeah, I think that it is you just stated it well and maybe understated it, because if we go back to the original picture of the glyph of Aries, how can it be introverted if the energy is gushing forth out of nothingness? In a way, when people ask me why I'm an astrologer or why I became interested in astrology, for years my answer was, my concern is how does nothing become something? Which is an Aries concern, because it's that first moment of spring. And yet from the moment of Scorpio to the moment of Aries, meaning from the time when the sun in the northern hemisphere goes into Scorpio, when those final pretty leaves in Libra turn brown and then are cut off from the life of the tree and they fall to the ground and it looks like death. It looks like there's nothing there. In Scorpio and through the Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, and yet in Pisces, something happens and that energy starts wiggling and jiggling on the inside. And in Aries, all of a sudden, there's new growth again. And it's that outrushing of energy that has pulled in maximum force in Scorpio that then in Aries comes back out. And so this idea that you just said is, like I say, I think you understated it, because it is so key to understanding the cycle of the zodiac that Aries couldn't be anything other than extroverted or intended towards push the energy outward, whereas Scorpio couldn't be anything but pulling that energy inward. That's the nature of what's going on in that part of each part of the cycle, in their each part of, still didn't say that right, in those two parts of the cycle.
Yeah, I like that. I'm just trying to look up definitions to get a quality definition, but one of the definitions from Cambridge Dictionary of Extroversion just says the quality of being energetic and not shy and enjoying being with other people, which kind of actually isn't a great definition and understates it a little bit. But this of like, let's say you're in a social situation, the person that like thrust themselves into the social situation and will go up and Linda Goodman was talking about, shakes the hands of new people and will initiate first contact with somebody, or will be the one to lead or set up a group of friends to go on an outing and be the one that sets that up, versus the person that maybe hangs back or isn't as comfortable walking up to a stranger or taking the lead in something or what have you.
I agree with all of that. However, there is also that picture that I described earlier of the mature lone Aries, that Aries who's willing to go off and be a pioneer and go off for 4 or 5 months and be by themselves in the wilderness, or to be an intellectual pioneer and spend decades in places that no one else can follow or understand. So there is that sense of aloneness that an Aries can over time choose. And yet what you say is still true.
Yeah, that's a good point. The solo tendencies or the single tendencies that we were talking about a little bit earlier?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, my Ariesness, I love the idea of being in a relationship. I love the idea of traveling with someone who you're close to or in love with. And yet I also have learned to love traveling alone, because when I travel alone, I have experiences that I would not have otherwise. And I'm not saying that one completely supplants the other, but they're two different ways of approaching things. And in my youth, I would have never, the idea of traveling alone would have been just awful. I mean, and yet, as I've, let's not use the word aged, let's say matured, I find that I've become more of a hermit, or more of aloof from the humdrum noise, might call it third house noise even. But still, when I'm around people, then I like to re-engage. So there's both facets there. This just spoken from a personal point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for all the signs, just the notion that people experience different parts of it at different stages in their life. Different people that you might be around might activate certain things in terms of your chart in different ways. I mean, for you, of course, I always think of your huge 11th house Aries stellium, and how you had worked with a friend for a number of years with Jeff Jar, and you two were known together. And I always laugh, and I've told this story about like walking into a Barnes and Noble, and there was like a big cardboard cutout of like both of you when you were both writing this yearly planner for Barnes and Noble, which was like a really big deal at the time, but just the, that connection with a friend at the time of and doing that work together.
Well, yeah. And by the way, that cutout, I wish I had one of those. I
know, me too. If I ever find one, it's going to be behind me in like every podcast episode.
But it was very strange walking into a Barnes and Noble in New York City and seeing Jeff and I life size, like weird. But I must say that 11th house stellium, as a younger person, I was the person who would have told you and meant it that I would be very happy living at conferences.
Okay.
Just being, and as you may know, as some people may know, until the mid late 90s, I had a very significant career also in organizing in the natural foods, health food, dietary supplement world. And so there were years when I would go to 2 or 3 or 4 conferences a month. And there were times when I thought, maybe I don't even need a home. I just can go from conference to conference. It's such an 11th house thing of being in a network of friends and just waking up and being in that group. And yet I have a Cancer moon that over the years has become more predominant. And I really like my time alone.
Yeah, well, and I remember that's how we first became friends, because you would come hang out at the Kepler College symposiums when all the Kepler students would fly out for a week in the middle of the semester for a week of lectures. And then after the lectures were over at night, everyone would hang out really late in the lounge and talk astrology. And you and I would end up just late at night staying up talking about different astrology topics during those trips. So that was how I first met you.
And often in conferences, I was the last person to leave a conversation. I mean, it was not unusual for that's where my Aries lack of staying power was not obvious. I would be the person who would be still going when everyone else was going to sleep.
Yeah, and then also just looking at your chart again with Gemini rising and Mercury in Aries applying to Mars, one of the other things that I always thought it was interesting about that time period is for a number of years you wrote daily horoscopes, and that was the one thing that would drag you away from the social setting and the social group. Was you're like, I got work to do, and you would leave
except often at 2 or 3 in the morning, I would then go back to my room and write. And for the record, I'm still writing a daily. I've been writing an astrological daily since the new moon in Aquarius in 2002. So we're looking at 21 years. And although I don't write anything for each of the 12 signs as I did for 17, 18 of those years, these days I'm writing more of what I call a daily astrological reflection of sorts. And that's available on Facebook and or Instagram, Rick Levine Astrologer, in both places.
Yeah, and I love that because it just shows, it's shorter form content, but it's showing you having long-term energy to do that and to do it like every day and to write something that's really powerful, though concise and relatively short, but it carrying, like a punch or carrying a bang to a kick to it.
So here's something else that I've noticed about myself. It's not something that I often talk about, but when you look at my writing career, I've probably written as many words, more words, but as many words as pretty much anybody out there. I mean, for the 8 years that Jeff and I co-authored the annual astrology guides for Barnes and Noble, those books were 150,000 words long. And although we co-authored them, we each, in effect, wrote every word. I mean, we detailed everything, regardless of who originated the text. On top of that, for those years and for 17, 18 years before and after, I was writing approximately 1,300 words a day, 7 days a week. And yet when you look at my writing, it's almost all like Tibetan sand paintings, which is an absolute Aries kind of a thing. Because with a Tibetan sand painting, you put all your concentration and all your focus on making this incredible thing of beauty. And then once it's done, you rake it gone. And unlike many other writers, my best work has a shelf life of 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And so my legacy as an Aries, Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu said, that the wise and realized person leaves no trace. Well, I hope I don't leave no trace. But unlike other astrologers who have written as many words or half as many words as I have and wrote them in books that leave legacies, my work largely as a stellium in Aries largely is here and gone, here and gone, here and gone. There is no staying power to a daily column.
Yeah, I love that. And just the impermanence of
Impermanence. Another good Aries word that impermanence.
Yeah, of writing a either daily horoscope or yearly horoscope, because once that year is over, it's something that people don't go back to for the most part to read again. It's just, it was powerful and impactful in that moment, and it had real importance in the immediacy. Again, going back to that notion of time and immediacy and being here and being now in the moment. And that was where its power was the most impactful. But that still ends up moving things. That still ends up being impactful and impacting things because it gets the ball rolling in the moment, even if it's not something that continues to linger around necessarily as a permanent fixture in your consciousness forever, like the initial push that it had of like moving the boulder and getting it rolling down the hill. Sometimes that can make a huge difference in people's lives.
Yeah. I sometimes call the Aries the fire starter, because that's what it does. It likes to get the ball rolling. It likes to prime the pump, give it one push, and then let someone else take over the, daily routine of pumping the water.
Yeah. That brings up some terms I want to make sure we mention, which is that I really love as Mars terms, and they get underused, but peppery, spicy, heating, fiery, and incendiary. But just the notion of like a pepper, and
those are all good. Those are all really good words, all in the same spectrum. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and just think about like a pepper and how sometimes you need that to add some spice to something, like a little bit of pepper can really spice up a dish and make it interesting and make it bring the heat up, make it a little hotter. But when done right, it's like not too hot, and it's just the perfect amount of heat that's added to something, or pepperiness or spiciness. Whereas on the other hand, sometimes if you just like eat like a ghost pepper, you're going to have a bad night because suddenly the heat explodes in your mouth and it's too much heat and it's too intense and it's like harmful or not experienced as a positive thing. So there's, again, just both sides of that double-edged sword, or that spectrum of Mars and Aries, where it can go either way.
Yeah. A good point. Not switching completely, but I noticed in your notes you had something that I didn't want to forget to talk about, and I did until I just saw it. And you have Zoller machine gun versus sniper rifle.
Yeah.
If you would share with us what you mean by that, that will lead into what I wanted to say and forgot.
Okay, so I've told this anecdote many times on the podcast, but I want to tell it again because not everyone has heard it, and because it's appropriate here. But the late Robert Zoller, who died a few years ago, was an astrologer. He was one of the first astrologers who really went back and started doing traditional medieval style astrology based on the work of Guido Bonatti and other astrologers like that. For about a year, I lived with him in the same house when I was living at Project Hindsight around 2007. And what's funny, I mean, ironically, being he was a great astrologer, and made a number of predictions that were very successful and did a lot of important work. But I always laughed,
including the bombing of the World Trade Tower. He's one that went on record with very precise information around that prior to it happening.
Yeah, he was one of the astrologers that got the closest of anyone maybe to predicting 9/11, just based on some of the statements he made based on traditional mundane astrology and some eclipses that happened across the East Coast in like 1999 and 2000. But despite all of that, like very exalted, like prediction and mundane stuff, one of the most insightful things he ever said to me one day is he said, the difference between Aries and Scorpio is that Aries is like a machine gun that just shoots a bunch of bullets indiscriminately, and Mars and Scorpio is like a sniper rifle that just shoots one shot dead on the target, and that's it. So it was just funny because that's one of the most striking analogies or metaphors that he ever shared with me that I always think back to sometimes when I try to think of the difference between Aries versus Scorpio.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And it gets back to the, although they're slightly different metaphors, what I said earlier, that if an Aries doesn't win on that first volley of fire, the Scorpio will always win in the long run.
Yes.
But what I was thinking when I saw that, that's a great image. I'll remember that image. What I was thinking is that I have Mercury in Aries, and I've been accused of what I'm going to describe. And that is, when I get going and I'm talking on a topic, my words can come out so fast that there's no room for me to breathe. There's no room for you to understand quite what it was that I said, because I'm already talking about something new and you can't go back and think about what I said. And the words come out like a machine gun, like fast and fast and fast. And then I go, and that can be 10 or 15 minutes. And it's that same, energy of Aries machine gun fire. It's just a rapid, it's a spray that is not basically going from here to there. And sometimes when I'm in that mode, I'll get like 3/4 of the way through it and I'll stop and I'll go, where was I going with this? I mean, I totally lose the directionality because I'm just shooting with whatever comes next in my mind. And then I have to pull back and remember and then go back into that, Scorpio mode of finding that target and bringing it to conclusion.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One last thing that somebody mentioned, I wasn't sure if it's true, and I was trying to think about it, but they said funny. In Twitter, a few people said that Aries are funny, and I was trying to reflect on that, if that was true, and think of different Aries comedians. We've talked about a few, of course, like David Letterman or like Conan O'Brien, but
Charlie Chaplin, I think, was in Aries, wasn't he?
Okay, yeah. But is it a funny sign, or is it a certain type of comedy? I mean, there might be maybe the boldness of, because I often think of like comedians as like a mercurial type thing. The talking and the being witty and coming up with jokes or little short bits. But there may be something to the Aries thing that would be very useful or fitting or appropriate, because Aries not being afraid to like say something that might be offensive to somebody, or the roast version of comedians where you like sort of make fun of like two comedians get up and they roast each other and they make fun of each other by saying cutting or biting things. That could definitely be a Martian or an Aries type thing, or even just having the courage to get up on a stage and do like stand-up comedy requires a certain amount of boldness and courage to like get up there and just like fail, but to keep trying.
Yeah. As you were talking, I don't have her chart and I don't know what her stuff was, but Dorothy Parker once said, "You can fake sincerity, but you can't fake wit."
Mm.
Here's where I think that comes from, and I wouldn't necessarily say that Aries are necessarily humorous or funny, although there seem to be a bunch of them that are lingering in the back of my mind that I'm only 80% sure that some of them are Aries or have Aries planets. But Freud wrote a book that is not widely known, and it's a book called Wit and the Unconscious.
Mm.
And basically in it, he makes the case that humor comes from a place where that which cannot be spoken, that which cannot be said, that which is either repressed, that means we bury it and we don't know we buried it, or suppressed, which means we buried it and we know we buried it. In either case, when those things come out into the open, that somehow it's acceptable for them to come out in a humor form where it's not acceptable for them to come out just stating them. And so the Aries who's in the moment and willing to take those risks, and in some ways we get back to that dance between the conscious and the unconscious that I talked about earlier, is how Aries really is unconsciousness, because everything that is included in the Aries, you know, the idea that the whole universe is part of me and therefore, you know, everything is me. I am the center of it because it is all within me. And because of that, the Aries has that tendency to be able to release those socially inappropriate zingers that are of the moment, that come out through humor as kind of a safe way for them to express. It's a thought. I agree with you. I still think that Mercury is there, but I mean that Mercury is important. But then again, if you're a sun in Aries, chances are you have Mercury in Aries too.
Yeah, for sure. And there's probably different types of comedy and different approaches to comedy. So it's kind of hard to pin down to one thing. And that's something we didn't get into too much here, but it's something I want to maybe come back to at different points in this series, which is just sometimes there isn't usually one sign that only does something, but sometimes you can kind of rank or do a hierarchy of, if you have a keyword, which sign is like comes to mind first for that, and then what's the second and third and fourth tier sign for that.
Agreed. Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you can do that in grouping like the cardinal signs, like what would Aries be the top in, or if you group the fire signs, which are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, you know, what would be the top ranking thing for like Aries, for example. Like maybe competitiveness. Like if you were to ask, like maybe all three of the fire signs might be competitive on some level, but if you had to like rank which one was the most competitive, maybe Aries would be it.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think that may be true. And, you know, I don't know. I can think of a lot of Sagittarians who are pretty funny, and Leos too. And is it a fiery thing? I don't know. I mean,
right. Or let's think, sometimes all three of the fire signs can be accused of having like an ego type thing, and different versions of that manifest in those three signs. Like we've talked a lot about the mindedness and wanting to be like a winner of Aries, but Leo, on the other hand, it can be more of a thing of wanting to be seen and wanting to shine, and that being sort of where that's coming from in some way. Or Jupiter sometimes wanting to not necessarily be the center of attention, but wanting to be seen as like knowledgeable or wise or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I've also seen you talk about other types of humor. I've seen the people who do physical humor often have Mars Uranus, you know, connections, for example, regardless of their sign. And so, yeah, I think it's more complicated than Aries are funny, although I'd like to think sometimes I'm funny. I think that sometimes I'm really funny and no one else gets the joke I just told.
Right. All right. There's one last thing I just remembered. There was this great thing posted in the Astrology podcast, the private Facebook group for patrons of the podcast, by a patron named Chloe Lawson, who posted, she just done this illustration for Aries to sort of commemorate Aries season. And it had a bunch of keywords for Aries that she wrote out. And this was before I was going to do this episode, but I asked if I could use this, and she said that would be okay. So she sent me the picture. So it's a drawing for those just listening to the audio version, but it says Aries, ruled by Mars, exalted Sun, cardinal, fire, ram, friction, spark, ignite, radiance, burning, bright, hot, flare up, ignition, now, sprint, impatience, just fucking do it, spontaneous, boldness, ego, courage, strike, headbutt, startup, inspiration, fury, frenzy, wild, frantic, fight, champion, drive, take a risk, throw caution to the wind, independent, fast, badass, content. What am I missing? Content, independent.
I think that's badass
contentious.
content.
No, contentious. Yeah. I think, and then burn or burn out, excess, selfish, I am, energy, quick, passionate, fearless, confident, decisive, red, first, exciting, impulsive, the head, new changes, and adventure. And that, gets to a lot of, we talked about a lot of those keywords, but it just nicely kind of summarizes or wraps up a bunch of major things that we talked about here.
Yes. And as you said, a couple of those keywords I was reminded of, and I don't have his chart right in front of me, but you said I am, and I began to think of I think, therefore I am. And Rene Descartes being, I think he had like 6 planets in Aries, if I'm not mistaken, a crazy number. I don't know if you have his chart handy. I'm not on my laptop where I have it. I mean, I'm not on my desktop. But that whole sense of, I am the center, I think, therefore I am. There we go. Look at that. Sun, node, Uranus, Jupiter, Pluto, and Mercury. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 planets plus the node in Aries. I think, therefore I am. That's a pretty powerful statement, I think. And those Aries planets trine Neptune.
I love that. That's beautiful. And then Mars is in Gemini, and it's in a mutual reception with Mercury.
Yeah. I think, therefore I am.
Right.
You heard about the story of, Descartes walks into the bar and the bartender says, "Can I help you?" And he goes, "I think not." And he disappeared.
Nice. All right. Are there any major things that we're forgetting? Obviously, it's way too broad. We were shooting for 2 hours. We've overshot that slightly, but we've covered a lot. But are there any major things we're going to kick ourselves for not mentioning that if you
the answer is yes, and we don't know what they are.
Right.
I can't think of anything. It's been a lot of fun. And I know that once we get off, I'm going to go, oh, I forgot to talk about, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, well, maybe people can help us out by writing in the YouTube comments below this video on the YouTube video version some of their significations or keywords for Aries, and if there's any major ones we left out, and then we can have a whole directory of those there. I'll also link to the Twitter thread where people can read other comments and other significations that people gave. And also shout out to Nick Dagan Best, who helped with some of the research for some of the chart examples we used in this episode, which is super helpful. And I wanted to mention your YouTube channel, because you are just killing it when it comes to YouTube at this point, and just regularly releasing videos and forecasts, and have just this like thriving and really great resource for people for regular daily and weekly astrology stuff at this point, right?
Yeah, it's actually on YouTube. It's more monthly and semi-monthly. And the one thing that is available for everyone is my monthly forecast, similar to what you do, but but different. And I find it interesting when I watch yours and see how some of the things we both talk about are so similar, and then there are things where we go in very, very different directions, and I like that. But that's really the freebie thing is my monthly, which is about an hour long. It's posted on the first of every month. There are a number of other. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And that's at youtube.com/Rick Levine.
Yeah. And then there are other things that I have available to my patrons, and at patreon.com/Rick Levine, you can find more about some of that stuff.
Cool. Patreon.com/Rick Levine. There it is with your different tiers. And you do a bunch of different bonuses and other offerings, including like meetups, and actually are doing Zoom sessions where you go over charts and different things like that.
Yeah, I have a monthly chart interpretation class that we do live interpretations of people in the class, where I am talking to like you as if I was doing your chart, but there will be the people out there on the webinar. And so I'm doing your chart and telling people out there why I'm talking about certain things, and then asking you to respond and tell us what the backstory is. And that kind of work is that's work that we couldn't have done, 20 or 30 years ago, because there was no way to first of all, there was no way to gather the audiences from all around the world, like on Zoom. And secondly, to be able to just take someone's chart and put it up and look at it as everyone else is looking at it in that moment is such a luxury that we have with computers that we just forget. And that's something that you and I talked about at length in the ESAR talk that we did for the Astrology Day program for that symposium back on Astrology Day, which is the vernal equinox every year. But we just forget how different it is being an astrologer and studying astrology is today compared to what it was 40 years ago.
Yeah, and I released that as episode 344 of the Astrology podcast, titled "The Future Trajectory of Astrology." That talk that we just did for International Astrology Day, and I think what we said is, or what I say it all the time, is there's literally been no better time ever in the history of the world to be an astrologer than right now, in terms of all the different resources and things that are available to people and that we can do. That it's really great time to be practicing into this.
Totally agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me for this and being the first to help me initiate and launch this new series on the 12 signs of the zodiac today, Rick.
Being in Aries, I could not have done any other than the first one.
Right. Sometimes you just got to do
what you got to do.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having this and for doing what you do for all of us.
Yeah. Well, this is a great start, and now I'm even more excited. So with any luck, I'm going to do one of these each month over the course of the next 12 months and go through each of the signs of the zodiac, and we should have a pretty good resource by the end of that for all 12 signs.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. I'll put a link to Rick's website and YouTube channel just below the description in this video or on the Astrology Podcast website. So please be sure to check it out. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at HellenisticaStrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.